Have you ever bought a camera lens only to realize it is not the one you needed? Well, you're not alone. Let's fix that so it doesn't cost you down the road. In this video, you'll learn everything you need to know about camera lenses, their types, their functions, how to choose the right one for what your vision calls for. Many photographers struggle with choosing the right lens for their specific needs. And that leads to a lot of frustrating results because they can't get the look they're going for. Believe me, I've been there. Trying to take a portrait with a very blurry background and the image just wasn't coming out how I envisioned it. And then later on, I started doing landscapes. I didn't really understand how the lenses worked. So I wanted to get everything in focus, so I was shooting at an aperture of f/22. And as I reviewed the images, I was noticing that they weren't as sharp as when I was shooting at f/8 or f/11. We'll start off with knowing the types of lenses, what their features are, what benefits they provide, and ideal use cases. First, we need to consider if you have a crop sensor or a full frame camera. Now, the reason being is you can use a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera, but not the other way around. Now, the exception being, if your camera has the ability, you can change it to crop mode. So comparing the two lenses, if you see the crop sensor lens, the opening for the sensor is smaller than the full frame one. And that's because the sensor is smaller on the crop frame camera. So putting a crop sensor lens on a full frame body defeats the purpose of having a full frame sensor. Now there are advantages to full frame sensors. For instance, it has better low light performance. The bigger the sensor, it allows to catch more light. And then another one is a blurry background. But since this video is about lenses, let's talk about, let's say there's disadvantages to using full frame lenses on crop sensor bodies. One major one being the angle of view. For example, a 24 to 70 millimeter full frame lens on an APS-C camera, its angle of view is actually the full frame equivalent of 36 to 105 millimeters. Now that's on a Sony APS-C camera with a magnification factor of 1.5. Now, depending on your camera brand, the magnification factor could be between 1.5 and 1.6. So you need to check with your camera manufacturer to see what the crop factor for your camera is. Now, Micro Four Thirds camera sensors are even smaller. They're half the size of a full frame camera, so they have a 2-time magnification factor. You can use full frame lenses on crop sensor cameras, don't get me wrong. But what you have to be aware of is if you're shooting in confined spaces, it's going to be very hard to get your entire scene in a frame because of that angle of view. Now, crop sensor lenses are made to have a slightly wider angle of view. Now, to be clear, you still have the magnification factor if you use crop sensor lenses on crop sensor cameras. Remember, it's not the lenses themselves, it's the sensor. That is what dictates what the magnification factor is. So the difference in those lenses is that they start with a wider view. So for instance, my 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens that I got with my Sony a6500, now at 18 to 55, the full frame equivalent is 27 to 82 millimeters. So now it's closer to the angle of view of a full frame lens like the 24 to 70. Zoom lenses and primes. Zoom lenses allow a person to zoom in and out of a specific scene, a person, wildlife, etc. It's a very versatile lens because it allows for a person to stand in one place and then capture different focal lengths of a subject or a scene. Now, prime lenses have a fixed focal length. You have to physically move closer or farther from your subject depending on if you want the subject to be bigger or smaller in your frame. Now, for the most part, prime lenses only have a focus ring, with the exception if you have a image stabilized lens, you'll have switches to turn on and off and that kind of stuff, but you won't have any other rings. Now, some prime lenses allow you to control the aperture directly from the lens with an aperture ring. However, at this point, those lenses really aren't that common yet, but they are growing in popularity. Like cameras, the Nikon, I know, and I'm not sure if it's a DSLR or a mirrorless, so if you know, drop it in the comments there for me. But Nikon has a camera that looks just like their film cameras from back in the day. So things are kind of, that's the shift right now where everything's growing in popularity for the vintage and retro style things. So lenses are no different. Now, what you're seeing here is a full manual lens, and it's a Laowa 15 millimeter lens. You can see the aperture ring here with its numbers. So in order for me to change the aperture, I have to physically do it with this ring, because on the camera itself, I don't even see an aperture number, so I can't change the aperture. But that's typically just for full manual lenses. All right, now let's talk about image quality on zoom lenses versus prime lenses. Because in the days of film cameras, prime lenses produced sharper images than zoom lenses. And that's because the quality of the glass that was used in them. Prime lenses at that time, well, basically now, prime lenses have less inner working parts, and they're able to get away with using higher quality glass in them because the lens itself didn't weigh as much. Now, zoom lenses obviously have more parts in them in order to move those elements back and forth so you can zoom in and zoom out. Therefore, they used less quality glass because the glass weighed less, and then it kept the overall weight of the lenses down. Today, that's a completely different story though. The image quality of zoom lenses are very close or equal to that of prime lenses. Even with pixel peeping, it is very hard to tell the difference between the two. So really, choosing a zoom lens or a prime lens comes down to your style of shooting or genre of photography. All right, next we have variable aperture versus constant aperture lenses. The variable aperture lenses are marked with an aperture number followed by another one. What that means is the first number is the widest the lens opens, followed by what the lens will close down to as you zoom. For example, my 200 to 600 millimeter lens, the marking reads 5.6 to 6.3. If I set my aperture to 5.6 in my camera, as I begin to zoom, the aperture starts to close down. By the time I reach 300 millimeters, the aperture will have closed down to 6.3. But then from 300 to 600 millimeters, it stays at 6.3. Now, the reason I bring this up is when I first started photography, I had an 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens, and it was a variable aperture lens. Now, I didn't know that, and I set it at the widest aperture. And I was taking photographs of my kids playing in the backyard, and I was snapping away, and I wasn't really checking the images on the back of the camera. So after I finished, I went in, downloaded it on my computer, and then started reviewing the pictures there. And I started to notice that some images were darker than others, and I didn't understand why. My first inclination was that I bumped a button or a dial or something and I changed the settings. So luckily my kids were still playing outside, so I went to the backyard, started taking pictures again, doing the same thing, this time being mindful not to bump any settings, any buttons, dials, or that kind of stuff. Well, finished there, went back to the computer, downloaded those photographs, and the same thing happened. Some images were brighter than others, and this is the reason why. Your camera will automatically close down the aperture as you zoom in. So if you do have a variable aperture lens, I would suggest that you set it to whatever the second number is where it closed down to. That way you don't have to worry about your exposure changing as you zoom in and out. Now, if you need the wider aperture, then set the wider aperture, but then you don't really get to zoom because then your exposure changes. So you're gonna have to treat it like a prime lens and then physically walk closer or farther from your subject depending on how you want it in the frame. Up next, we have specialty lenses. Macro lenses fall into this category because they allow you to work close to your subject. Every lens has a minimum focusing or working distance. With a macro lens, you're able to work closer than standard lenses. Now, your standard lenses are typically minimum working distance is usually about a couple feet or further, where your macro lenses allow you to get within inches of whatever subject that you are photographing. For instance, I love coffee. The other day I started doing some macro shots of coffee beans, trying to do a series on basically coffee beans and drinks and that kind of stuff. So taking pictures of the macro or of the coffee beans, I think I was able to get into with about 10 inches or so of the coffee beans, and then really get in there and get a nice close-up of those coffee beans. There are different focal lengths of macro lenses. The longer your focal length of the macro lens, the further the working distance is. So for instance, if you have we'll say I think there's a 60 millimeter macro lens, there might be wider, but I know for sure there's a 60. I have a 90, I believe there's 105 millimeters. And at 105 millimeters, your working distance might be 11 inches to maybe 13, 14 inches, where your 60 millimeters, you might have a working distance of maybe 6 inches, 7 inches. You're gonna have to check those out, but the point being is the longer your focal length, the longer your working distance is gonna be. So another thing with macro lenses is you have your aspects of 1:1, 2:1, 5:1, and what that means is, like my 90 millimeter macro is a 1:1 lens. So when I photograph the subject, if I don't crop in or make the image bigger in post-processing, your subject or your object in your frame is going to be a 1:1. Basically, it'll be true to size, true a life size. Now, with the 2:1 macro lenses, 5:1 macro lenses, what they're going to be is they're going to be 2 times the size, 5 times the size of true life. Right now, I know Laowa makes a 10 time to 50 time magnification lens, which is absolutely crazy and absolutely amazing at the same time. Basically, at that 50x, you can take a grain of salt and fill your entire frame with just that one grain of salt. I mean, it's awesome. So if you're into macro, check those out. Tilt shift lenses is another specialty lens, and those let you take pictures of objects with lines and keep those lines straight up and down. And how that works is it allows the lens itself to tilt up and down and then shift left to right, keeping the back of the lens in the same place. And then that leaves your sensor on the same plane as whatever you're taking a picture of. When you tilt your sensor compared to what you're taking shots of, that's when the distortion starts to come in. So with the tilt shift lenses, it allows the front of the lens to tilt and then shift, and keeping the sensor on the same plane, and therefore minimizing and or mitigating the distortion, period. Architectural photographers use tilt shift lenses, and it's fantastic. If you're doing indoor shots as well, if you want to keep those corners straight up and down, or horizontal lines, it all keeps those where they're supposed to be without bowing or any kind of distortion. Another use for the tilt shift lenses are for smaller panoramic images. Now, because the shift on the lens isn't that big, that's why I say you can use it for smaller panoramic images. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room: third-party lenses. Now, third-party lenses have come a very, very long ways from when they first started. Now, it wasn't unusual for a third-party lens not to be able to focus with any kind of speed or accuracy. Not to mention, the image quality was not the best. I remember those days, and it took forever for the autofocus to lock onto your subjects. Now, when I was taking portraits, I would have to tell a person to stay still, and then even with that, the autofocus was still hunting. It took forever. Waiting on it to lock on, it was crazy. And then I had to tell my person or my subject that I was photographing that basically I'm waiting for the autofocus to lock on. You know, you're doing everything fine. You look great. And it was just very awkward. When it finally did lock on and I captured pictures, and it's one of those where you're just firing off. I had focused on the eye, but then the eye was blurry. And then as I'm reviewing the images on the back of my camera, and I'm blowing up the images to make sure that I'm not just seeing things, the eye was blurry. But then you'd have the nose was sharp or the ear was sharp, and it was a mess. For wildlife, forget it. By the time the autofocus locked on, whatever behavior or action that I was trying to capture, it was over. And as you know, with wildlife, you only get one shot. If you're not ready, or if your equipment is failing, that's it. You more than likely will not get that shot again. So now, a very, very different story. One of my third-party lenses is a Sigma. I chose to buy the Sigma 24 to 70 millimeter art lens due to the cost. Now, if you're not familiar with Sigma, just like any other brand, they have 3 tiers of lenses. Now, their art lenses is their top tier. They have their sport lenses, which is kind of the middle ground. And then they have their contemporary lenses, which are basically the intro or the kit lenses. So my art lens that I bought, at the time that I bought it, was $1,000 less than my Sony 24 to the Sony 24 to 70 millimeter G Master lens. Now, I was skeptical at first because I just that big of a price difference was mind-boggling. So I did a lot of research, YouTube, trying to check out images that people were posting, and I finally went ahead and purchased the lens. As you can see with some of these images I'm putting up, the image quality is absolutely fantastic. And the autofocus works as if it was a native Sony lens. I mean, it is fantastic. Another third-party lens I have is the Laowa 15mm, and that's made by Venus Optics. And I had mentioned this lens just a little bit ago. Now this is the wide angle lens, and I mostly use it for landscapes or interior shots. Looking at this image here, I did try it once with this building. It's a courthouse in San Antonio, Texas. It actually did pretty good, except it still had a little bit of distortion in there. And the reason being is because I actually did a panorama, which you really don't want to do with wide angle lenses because of that same problem. But like I said, I mostly use it for interior shots. For instance, my wife and I, we sold our camper probably about 2 or 3 years ago. And I used this lens to get as much real estate as I could inside the camper. Now, I took the images, processed them, put them on Facebook, and they came out fantastic. I think it was less than a week before we sold the camper after we posted it on Facebook. Facebook Marketplace. So it was, I mean, this lens works fantastic. All right, so remember the story at the beginning when I was saying that capturing an image at f/22 was not as sharp as when I was shooting at f/8 or f/11? There is an issue when light rays pass through a small opening going through glass. When you have your aperture set at f/22 or smaller, it creates a small opening in your lens for light to get through. Now, as light passes through the opening, those rays bend around the aperture blades, and then when they meet on the other side, they don't quite line up. They are scattered everywhere and don't go into the focal point that they need to, where it makes your image crisp and sharp. So all those light rays bouncing around in there is what creates the softness in your image, and that's called diffraction. So instead of shooting your images at f/22, like if you're out there doing landscapes or really anything else, because this is for macro shots as well, because you are so close to your subject that your depth of field is sometimes an inch or less. So you're going to have to do what basically I'm going to say is, instead of shooting at f/22, take an aperture of f/8 or f/11 and then take your images by focusing at different parts of the frame. So take your frame, focus in one location, take a third up, focus there, take another image, third up, focus there, take the image, and so on until you get through your entire frame. Once you're done taking the images, then take them back into Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever your editing software is, and then you stack those images. And then at f/8 or f/11, you use that stacking method, and you will have very sharp images from front to back every single time without having that diffraction issue. So that's what I was going to say about the macro lens, is the same thing. Because you're so close to your subject, you have to light it. You have to use a lot of light because you're at f/8, f/11, and even at f/11, because you're so close to your subject, your depth of field is sometimes just millimeters. So by using this technique, you're able to get sharp images from front to back without having to worry about diffraction. Right. So the next tip is really about the lens. Every lens has a sweet spot. Now, depending on how wide the aperture opens on that lens will depend where that sweet spot is. So for instance, if a lens has the widest aperture of 2.8, typically that sweet spot will be between f8 and f11. So Eric, if the sweet spot depends on the lens, what if the lens widest opening isn't f2.8? Well, that's actually an excellent question. For the most part, and I say that because there are exceptions to rules, right? For the most part, the sweet spot on lenses will be anywhere from 3 to 4 stops down from your widest aperture. So for instance, if your lens's widest aperture is f4, then f11 will be the start of your sweet spot. Now, just to be clear, diffraction actually starts at about f16. So try not to go past f16 if you can. If you can, don't even use f16. That way you avoid that diffraction at all costs, right? Because later on in post-processing, you're gonna have to try and sharpen your image, and then you're gonna have to mask out the places where they were already sharp, because if you don't, then it just looks unnatural. So this technique will actually help you speed up your processing and your workflow in your post-processing. All right, everybody, we have covered a lot of ground today, from understanding crop sensor and full frame lenses to third-party lenses and understanding diffraction. But there's so much more to explore. And in the next video, we're going to dive deeper into specific lens recommendations and different types of photography, including portraits, landscapes, wildlife, and so on. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications so you don't miss out on part 2. Also, I would love to hear from all of you out there. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments, whether it's stuff we've covered so far, maybe something I forgot to cover, or another question that you may have. I want to hear from you guys. I will answer them as quickly as I can. All right, until next week, check out these other helpful videos. See ya.